Okay, we will talk about civil liberties and civil rights, what they mean, what they are, difference between both, some examples, and which one I believe personally are more important. Uh, Many use civil liberties and civil rights as the same thing. They talk about it in the same way. They're not. There are differences between both. Civil liberties are limitations placed on government, so that government can't infringe upon. Sorry, my personal liberties. For example, freedom of speech. If I want to protest against the war in Iraq, government can't silence me. I'm free to do that. Later, we will get into some limitations freedom of speech has, because there are some. I'm not free to speak however ever I want. I can't incite violence, for example, but we'll get into that later. And civil rights are to ensure equality mostly. Historically and generally, they have been they're used to protect minorities against the majority. A good example are discrimination against black people in the United States historically. White people have been more, and the majority oppressed the minority in different ways. One example is in education. Before a decision, a Supreme Court decision that ensured the civil right of black people to get into the same education as any other as white people. That's Brown v. Board of Education. The before that decision, though, those rights didn't exist, and there was disparity between two different ethnic groups because of the race. So, a way to consider differences to identify civil liberties and civil rights. Civil rights are to ensure equality of the rights, and civil liberties are to protect against government. So, let's get into some examples. Let's start with civil liberties. 3 examples of civil liberties. Free speech. We have examples of the using of free speech against power since long ago. Here I researched this morning that at the time of the Roman Empire, there was a person named Cato, and he used his speech to speak in opposition of Julius Caesar in the Roman Senate. I'm sure there were no protections against freedom of speech at that time, so I really don't know what happened to Cato that much. But I do know that Cato then inspired 2 British authors, let me get the names right, John Trenchard and Thomas Gordon, hundreds of years later, that wrote the Cato Papers, which advocated for strong protections, legal protections, constitutional protections for free speech. And those writings actually inspired and helped James Madison when he drafted our First Amendment in our Constitution. So those papers had an influence in the protections for freedom of speech that we enjoy today. So yeah, then we have the right to privacy. This we also inherited. We have gotten a lot out of British philosophy, law. For example, the Cato Papers we just talked about here, and the right to privacy, the second civil liberty we are talking about. We got the principle that a judge, Sir Edward Coke, started to develop, that began with the quote, "A man home is his castle. The house of everyone is to him as his castle and fortress, which ensure protections for your privacy inside your home. You could defend your house by killing an unjustified intruder, and you wouldn't face any legal repercussions. You do have a limit to this if the government gets a warrant. As we have said, civil liberties protect you against government. If government gets a warrant, they can go into your house, or yeah. And the third civil liberty is the right to a fair court trial. Once again, civil liberties, they protect you against government. If the government is prosecuting you, it would be unjust for the government to determine if you're guilty or innocent. So we have, thanks to our Sixth Amendment, a trial by jury by our peers, that then after a due process of law, of court hearings, etc., they determine if you're guilty or innocent. This dates back to the time of Socrates, when they actually thought that it would be much fairer if the people decided on the guiltiness of a person. Let me check what I have here. Yeah, so that several centuries later, after Socrates, trial by the jury was introduced in England, where it became a fundamental feature of the legal system. It checked on government, and that's what civil liberties are supposed to do. They check on government. Here in the United States, as I said, we have the Sixth Amendment that was adopted in 1791, of course. Now let's move on to the civil rights. Okay, we have already touched upon that civil rights are meant to ensure equality among different people. And historically, we have had disparities in the right to vote. First, there were only men, adult men, white men that were allowed to vote. And then we had the 15th Amendment that ensured the civil right of black people, black men, to vote as well. And after that, the 19th Amendment that ensured the civil right for women to vote also. And then in education, the same as I touched at the beginning for the first example I gave on civil rights. Education, the Supreme Court ruling of Brown v. Board of Education guaranteed that all students have the equal access to public schooling, and declared that segregation was not legal. And then there was also discrimination in the workforce for employment. The movie industry, actually, they did not hire black actors to play black characters or whatever. They actually painted in blackface white actors. So once again, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 made that illegal. There cannot be disparities for your race or gender to prohibit your employment. So now I will talk with what I believe is more important, if civil liberties or civil rights. It's hard for me to say one is more important than the other, but I would say that here civil liberties are clearly more important. I don't know if clearly, but if it weren't for civil liberties, not only we would have to protect the minority against the majority. We will have to protect everyone against the power of government. Speech could be silenced. You could go to to prison for whatever if you don't have a fair trial. Your home could be searched all the time. Not all the time, but whenever the government pleases. So civil liberties concern basic freedoms, civil rights, the treatment of individuals or more specific groups. So yeah, I would say that civil liberties are more important because they are universal protections for everybody against government, and which is the most powerful entity in a nation. Government has the power, has the monopoly of force, so it's important to have guardrails against them. And yeah, civil rights, civil liberties have been perfected over the years. They are not perfect, but civil liberties are the most important, in my opinion.